Good morning, Your Holiness. Good morning, Your Holiness.
Good morning.
I would like to begin by thanking you for gracing us with your presence today. It's such an honor and privilege for us to share time with you, Your Holiness, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone joining us around the world. Your Holiness, I'm Daniel Aitken, CEO and publisher at Wisdom Publications, and today we gather online to celebrate the publication of the latest volume in the Science and Philosophy in the Indian Buddhist Classics series, known in Tibetan as Senrik Kuntu. Here at this book launch, I'm delighted to be joined by the series editor, Thupten Jinpa, the principal translator of this volume, Dr. Dechen Rochard, and the author of the contextual essays, Professor John Dunne. On behalf of Wisdom, I'd like to thank them for their amazing work in bringing this incredible book to fruition. I think, Your Holiness, you can see everyone else on the screen as well, so I'll let you know that we're also joined by the translator of the first volume, Dr. Ian Coghlan, and the translator of the forthcoming volume, Volume 3, Professor Donald Lopez. Also present are over 12 different language translators and Wisdom's editors of the volumes. So, Your Holiness, today's book launch celebrates the publication of the latest volume in the series. This is called The Mind. This volume is the second volume in an ambitious 4-volume series. And there they are there. That's the series. So this series was conceived and compiled under Your Holiness's visionary guidance as part of a project to share with the larger world the knowledge and insights of the great Nalanda tradition of Buddhism. The Tibetans have been the faithful custodians, the holder of the wisdom of the Indian masters from the Nalanda tradition. And now through His Holiness' vast activities and through this ambitious project, the wisdom of the Nalanda tradition is being offered not only back to India, but to the entire world. Your Holiness, Wisdom Publication is honored, and indeed it's a great joy to play a part in fulfilling the vision of His Holiness and to help make these texts available to the English-speaking world. So, Your Holiness, as you know, the first volume is already available around the world. So this is this volume. It's called The Physical World, and it explores the material world. So from the macroscopic to the microscopic. And then, yeah, Your Holiness, you have the second volume there. So that's the new one. And so the new volume, this is the second volume. It's called The Mind, as you know, and the Buddhist concept, it talks about the Buddhist conception of the mind and consciousness. And the book provides a vision of the inner world with fascinating implications for the contemporary disciplines of cognitive science, psychology, and the philosophy of the mind. So, Your Holiness, as you know, in the first volume, we cover the outer world. And in the second volume, we cover the inner world. And yet there are 2 more volumes to come. So, Your Holiness, I wish I could be there with you because it's such a great honor and privilege for Wisdom Publication to publish these. But still, I wanted to be able to offer you the book virtually. So, Your Holiness, I have a kata here, and I'll just get the microphone. And so, Your Holiness.
Thank you.
So, Your Holiness, I hope that arrived in Dharamsala there. So, Your Holiness, we're going to have a question and answer session very shortly about the book. I'm going to ask you about, the benefit of this book and the Nalanda tradition. But first, I wanted to invite Professor John Dunne, who wrote the illuminating contextual essays in this volume, to just say a few things about the role of those essays in the book. So, John, I'll hand it over to you.
Oh. On.
Yeah.
Sound.
Oh. Yes.
John Dunne, unmute.
Gonda, Gonda, sorry. So it's a real pleasure to see you again, Your Holiness. I'm coming to you from Madison, Wisconsin, where you've been several times, and and many people here send their greetings to you. The Senrik Kuntu, the second volume on the mind, is really an incredibly important piece of work. It's going to have, I think, a real impact on the dialogue between Buddhism and science. And part of the reason for that is that there really is a perspective that Buddhism brings, which science doesn't quite have. It's very important, I think, for scientists and philosophers, scholars to have the alternative perspective, a kind of new perspective that Buddhism presents, especially on the mind and the way that the mind works. But in order for us to make this volume really have a max...
디 첸리 바단 신바속이 어랑스디 샤쇼베 다직 더죽다 셈게 남샤고라 딘제 시행고에 대 개침부인 거지.
But in order to really make this volume very accessible for scientists and philosophers from the West, we thought we needed to write some contextual essays. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One of them is that there are certain types of very fundamental motivations, as you know, Your Holiness, for the presentation of the mind in Buddhism, which really has to do with the relief of suffering. But science doesn't always come from these same kinds of motivations. So it's important for scientists to understand the way in which this fundamental motivation informs the perspective on the mind that is coming from Buddhism. That was one reason we thought we needed these essays. Another reason is that actually Buddhism, because it has this new perspective, sometimes is difficult for scientists and others to understand. So for example, the Buddhist presentation of the mind does not include the idea that there is a controller, an autonomous self that is the controller of the aggregates, for example, what we call in Sanskrit an Atman. And so, but in the West, there's kind of an assumption historically in science that in some sense or another, there must be a self. But of course, in a controlling autonomous self. But of course, in neuroscience, we know that this has changed, and yet this is a new view. And so it's very helpful to have essays that explain some of these from the Western perspective, which are quite new and maybe even unusual and difficult to understand perspectives. Part of what I tried to do when I wrote these essays, to the best of my ability, was also to build some bridges between the Buddhist perspective and the perspective we find in Western science and Western philosophy. So for example, when we think about the distinction between the conceptual and the non-conceptual, when we think about the category of not the five omnipresent functions, or the distinction between two categories, the kundronga and the yungenga, what we call the five omnipresent semjung, the five omnipresent mental functions, and the five with a determinate object, what we call the yungenga. That distinction actually, in very interesting ways, relates to a distinction that's been emerging over the last couple of decades in Western science, cognitive science, about the distinction between what we can sense, what we can experience, but can't really describe, and then what we can describe. So we call this a distinction between the phenomenal and the access consciousness. So this is just one example of the kinds of distinctions that we've tried to build bridges with between the Buddhist material and the Western cognitive scientific and philosophical material. That helps, we think that by writing essays in this way, it will help readers who don't have much background in Buddhism to really appreciate the incredibly important information, the really in some ways quite amazing contribution that the Nalanda tradition has to the study of the mind. And finally, thinking about, we also try to point out some maybe issues or ideas that would be especially useful for scientists and researchers to examine. In particular, we thought, for example, that the theory of meditation, as you know, here at Madison at the Center for Healthy Minds with my colleague Richie Davidson, we do a lot of work on what happens when we meditate. What are the effects of different kinds of meditation practices? But in order to do that, we need theories. And actually, the Buddhist tradition, as you know, of course, Your Holiness, has many very profound theories about how meditation practices operate. And so we also tried to point out to our readers in these essays how some of these theories might be very useful for their own research. For example, theories about the distinction between mindfulness and meta-awareness, or what we call Jinpa and Sheijing. So that kind of distinction is something that we really tried to point out as being potentially very useful for our readers, especially those who are not so familiar with Buddhism. This is the goal of these essays. I hope I've managed to do not too bad a job anyway. I did the best I could, and it was a real honor to work on this project. There are many people I could thank, but I know that Geshe Thupten Jinpa will give thanks to everyone. So I just want to thank Wisdom Publications for the opportunity to make a contribution to such an important project. And thank you, Your Holiness, for really bringing this project to life. Tujichela.
So, Your Holiness, as Professor Dunne was pointing out, is the Buddhist perspective is actually an alternative or unique perspective. But also, I think this series, Your Holiness, that you've created and conceived is unique even in the history of Buddhism. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what is it, Your Holiness, that sort of made you, or what was your reason for initiating this special series, the Sanari Kuntu?
Okay. I respect all major world religious tradition, in spite different philosophy, different concept, all carry message of love, with that message of forgiveness, tolerance, and self-discipline. All religion, you see, carry this message. So that, and then simply, I usually see telling people, the religion is human creation from the Buddhist viewpoint. So all religion, you see, mentioned best quality of human life. So that's compassion, forgiveness, these things, contentment, or these things are, you see, in order to human beings' life become more peaceful. For that, these are very important. So therefore, logically, all major religions, which essentially human creation, then we human being, you see, mentioned the best quality of human being, which something useful for life, for happy life. So I respect all major religious tradition, wonderful. And even within Buddha's own sort of disciple, there are different people. So Buddha taught accordingly different philosophy. So it is quite clear. Firstly, I want to express the religious harmony is very important. You see, it is quite, unrealistic and also very bad. My religion, their religion. And then use that reason and fight, killing. Really unfortunate. So now we must make every effort to promote religious harmony. In order to do that, it is useful to know the different religious sort of what they are thinking, their main message, and different philosophy. Then you realize, oh, these different religious traditions have something to offer human being. Now regarding Buddhism, Buddha himself mentioned the monks, scholars should not accept my teaching out of faith, but rather investigation. Kelon tagam khanam ji siksha darwe session do lekorta la ngai ka lawar chai kuchir min sat. Ji jurge. Tneswa dis jurge. Siksha darwe session do lekorta la ngai ka lawar chai crucial means.
The Buddha himself said that all monks and learned scholars, just as a goldsmith would examine the quality of the gold by cutting, rubbing, and burning, in the same manner, examine my words, and then on that basis accept them, not out of devotion.
Then the Buddhism, particularly Nalanda tradition, see, the Pali tradition not much use reason, rather faith. Buddha stated that as a follower of Buddha, you see, we whether they mention or not, as a Buddhist follower of Buddha, we must accept what Buddha say. Then Nalanda tradition. Nalanda actually also the education center, learning center. So then Nalanda take the Buddhist tradition. Then since they are also the education center, so they utilize a logical approach, always investigate. So in principle, even Buddha's own word, through investigation, through logical approach, if there is contradiction, then we should have right to reject Buddha's own word. So now, since Buddha himself, you see, my follower should accept, should carry investigation, my teaching, not just faith. So Nalanda, since also the education center, so they already use Praman, Sama, logic. So in Buddhism, now they extensively use logical approach. They basically use Buddhism now Sanje Namji Che Temba, Temba Nili Yanda Den, Jigden Kuzo Temba Dang, Tambe Tangi Temba Hoseni, Sanje Che Temba Di, Temba Nil Den Yoris. Di Chik Dage, Temba Ni Sadi, Sanje Serke Mari, Jumde Le Tabake Mari, Kongo Nezuri, the Nungsu the Nisu Sajigi, or the Tensang quantum physics Tani, Nungsu the Nisu Yi Shayung Yori. Sadiri in this ane, da Ganda Chigi Nisu, the Turtu de Shay in this ane, Tandam de Bassach. Nungsu di Gane, Tanya Guzo de Bassach. So that Debani Namsha di, other Sao Shayung Gudua. That they Ganda Shingove Nisu, or that they any Shilshani. Any Kasur Shingove Nisu, Lam Dreve Jimba, Javungo to Chisus. As a near the Pendujuni got a double t-shirt in our she needs you Deni Tenshishing. Then she called you to Shishi. Simon Chamber gives some Tabadan, Talams also with Chingilosin. Meditator, she Tambanisa. Tambani Shilishabe, Talia, Naranzo, any Dungemi do about the down the shine in the sun, that Didu said Digi, any Thupten said the sewing Gutua. That Thupten said the Dungemi do about the down the in the sun, that day Melam Jim Rugmaris, that day Dungegi Juda, David Judy Session. Any Dungegi Judy Nurta, Galigally Dungegu Petcal Samis, or David Judy Rimbia, Yaja Combedane, Drach. So today in this ane, 시 대니 타네 담바 시디셔 것도 동네 담바 근주 담바 고베 담바 람지 담바 사치 다 동네 담바 사데 동네디 동네죠 동네 주에 동네 두지기 동네 세네 동네 숨 여대바 다 동네 차라 숨 여대바 지기 다 가당 가란즈 동네지 동네 다 소 동네들이 디프 튼주주의 신거리 주에 동네 사데 가란즈 다 튼주도 자시면 가란즈 미 소 대화리야 지대야 지기 간다 더도 동네지야 지기 제용을 교동에서도 다 대탐지기 시설고 누지기 동에서 해야 되잖아. 다 누지기 동에서 해야 돼. 아니 사지 저거래다. 동에 누시 봐서 다 귤이야. 된다고 인도산에 아니 군주단 봐서 동에단 봐. 군주단 봤어. 다 되네. 아니 동에기 교 레는 녀몽 보니 다 되게 소르디 녀몽 왕게 아니 샹라 너바다 되게 간다 가수를 보게 미기베 레디기 간다 다 녀몽 왕게 랑라 차 샹라 땅 되게 차당 그 왕게 아니 레사용 거 여러와 자 되게 인도 고물루기 레다 녀모 세베 탈 레다 녀모 남돌레 대다 쩨레 쩨바니 동번이 인가고 줄스네 다 고물루가 손샤다 데리 제가 데리 당연히 이지 되고 싶은 내 이지 되는 거 맞다 다 줄시 다 로사업에 안 당고 돼요래 제가 그 줄시
I'll summarize. His Holiness began by citing from Nagarjuna, where Nagarjuna says in his fundamental treatise on the middle way that all the teachings taught by the Buddha was taught within the framework of two truths. And these two truths are the conventional truth and the ultimate truth. And the point Nagarjuna is making is that, at the heart of the approach is really understanding the nature of reality. And the nature of reality is composed by the two aspects of reality. One is conventional and the other one is ultimate. And these two aspects of the reality is not something the Buddha has actually taught, created, or they are part of the reality. And this is why in Buddhism, right from the beginning, emphasis is placed on understanding the nature of reality. And these two truths, the conventional reality is the level of truth that is based upon our perception of reality on the appearance level. But appearance deceives, and there is a disparity between the way things appear to us and the way things actually are, truly are. And the ultimate truth really pertains to the truth that is in the ultimate objective sense, the way things are. So this disparity between the appearance and reality is an important part of understanding the nature of reality. So when the true truth teaching is further elaborated on, then you have the teaching on the Four Noble Truths, the truth of suffering, which is our reality, and the causes of suffering, which is the origin. And when we look at the suffering itself, the Buddhism speaks of three different levels of suffering. One is the evident suffering, which even the animals are able to identify, recognize as something undesirable. Then there is the second level, which is suffering of change, which let alone animals, even most human beings confuse that level of suffering to be actually pleasurable and happiness, but they always have the seed for dissatisfaction. And both of these levels of suffering are underpinned by a fundamental reality of suffering, which is the basic fact of being susceptible to conditioning. So that's a suffering of pervasive conditioning. And these reality of suffering really comes from their causes. So the point being made here is that if suffering is something that we do not desire, then the logical thing to do is to examine what are the causes that are giving rise to it and reduce the suffering causes, and ultimately eliminate the causes. And the elimination of the causes relate to two main causes. One is karma and the afflictions. And the after all, it is affliction that underpins all the karmic activity that give rise to suffering. And here Nagarjuna says again in the treatise on the middle way that the liberation is constituted by cessation of karma and afflictions. And karma arises from afflictions, and affliction arises from conceptual elaboration. And conceptual elaboration is underpinned by ignorance. And it is through elimination of these causal processes that leads to liberation. So the point here is that a key to all of this is really understanding the nature of reality.
So the third noble truth, nirvana, cessation. Now it is important. Is it possible to eliminate all these negative emotion? So now, third noble truth, you see, deal with that. Once we develop the clear sort of awareness or understanding or possibility, the causes of suffering can remove. Then we develop the enthusiasm to practice. There's a fourth noble truth, Lamjit Tempa. So now, these very clearly mentioned the elimination of our negative emotion will not come through prayer, through faith, but training our mind. So since the training, the fourth noble truth, the marg. So for that, now we have to know about mind. Then the negative emotion, which causing suffering, and the positive, wisdom or understanding can purify our mind. So for that reason, firstly, we have to know very thoroughly about the very nature of mind. The one, one text mentioned, Simji Renshin Vesawa, Chimundam Lubruwa Schen. The main nature of mind is clear light. There are several levels of mind or emotion. The grosser level, these destructive emotion on the level of grosser level of mind. Then these are, you see, due to certain factor develop. So all these negative emotion on that level. Then more subtle level, including when we deep sleep or meditation, another level. Then the deepest, at the time of death, all Roshinja Jukundo or Nangji Topsum Kutane Yondeagi or the Nangji Topsum Pangani, Vesechigo Shine Dizane, Yomungu Yoya Yomari.
So at the point of death, which is really a culmination of a prolonged dissolution process, during which all the levels of conceptualization and thought processes which are indicative of many of our grosser levels of our experience, come to dissolve through stages and eventually culminating in a complete dissolution, which is referred to as the pure luminosity or clear light. And at that state, the mind is really pure and clear, and it's totally free of any manifest levels of afflictions.
So one way, it is very important to investigate about the very nature of mind and different level of mind. The innermost subtle mind, the verses, the human history verses, 나조다 치외 내걸로 치외 성분도 집에 내걸로 verset인 것도 사용되어요.
So the subtlest level of mind, which even ordinary people's experience, is at the point of death, and it's referred to as the primordial, mind of clear light or luminosity, and which is something that even ordinary peoples will naturally experience at the point of death.
된 주단 찍으시자. 그 콜로스베 걸리야 에네 심지는 시에서 어디 봐 송니. 에네 심 차라 태가를 송이야 말이지. 간다 벌써디 나 라미기 중리야. 다 법이 심 차라 요치네. 선들이 인도산에 유물 희지집에 왜세 땅건도 제 왜세디 이것도 제윤도 에네 러시제 주군도 참말로 가지고 요래. 다들人生 현직이 되지 용기요래. 저 땅 알아서 지 가서 그래. 처직네 시와 코랑 그 때문에 라폴 루브와 지 녀몬 남주 영약이 있다. 시바디 차로 동약이 다시 찍. 디 콜로스베 전다지. 다 콜로 발베 그도네 최토지 러시지 동어리 사디. 아니 동번이 그人生 송샤 다 안다 대다这里这边的东北已经搞完就是下个这把下的电视个这把来下呢他的10节哪里啊呢绿了流亡之心的地目跟了那就的提醒你莫他们这些地目上边上班就但是这帮中国通了地目中民就提醒白把关键的当的通嘛念不查是呢10节那送下的第一下就是他的语言个差呢是的유지서를 단다 시베 정신 차네 외서서 직세 다 콜로 발베크도네 아니 최탐지 정신이 동버리스 다 되게 아니 나란솔이야 최노 정신이 주거지 능기여 나왔다도 아니 정신이 주번 진이 진베 댄징 남도 대견베 아니 녀모지기 어레스네 아데 쉬지버서야 되리 자상거다 탑시 이전에 유진 거라 차단 자직 다 용몽주 리시제베데베지 가다 조진기 최가 나라 심도 리브 현지사티 그다 심슬럽드 나제 토송 순지기 아니 가서 지기때 똑배로 지디 심사티다 가다 유를 아대긴 즈버 용돼야지 대 심사티 다 리버사디 리버 상데스럽디 이게 아니 로라포티디 파가니 아니 요모디디 고 로라베 제이브이드잖아 고 기아메르 용기야래 딘데지기 아니 nga kita chege nga lami ki chege shebegena nang시 토송 가네 아니 탐제도 뭐 외세서야디 조조 리버 이시서 될 삼던 거래 서다 될이야 아니 조직이 중나로 리더디 아니 딘주 numchos 띠기 루질이야 띠기 루디기 차 탐제를 아니 띠기 그 가수를 보게 식지 가수를 보게 내르디 딘두군을 쳐디어리스 어디는시 말한서 시바시 인신절라 이놈을 해지집에 외세를 샤데바 인도산에 그 가다 외세디 시바 타다를 쳐디어리스 당한서 가르쳐 걸었으나 라볼루브르에 시바디디 파 탑시 챤니 아다 당아 급내기나 에네코 지 룽그 내저다 지 된데게 타네 애니 시와 라고디 파 곡톱체 쟤네 애니 시와 차와된 건도 교야게 배수지식이 요래 다디 심리 현신이 아니 리고 상태에서야 디가라 다 론줘야지 배수지식 다 수저디 시식이 중은 나라도 아니 친절로고 로되기 지들 시험번 난시 된了内容再去写呢是吧다디 우메 중내再去写的我们录制过算的肯定都不是可是肯定都不没有全国也不没有哎그래更是定住没有全国也不没有这些都没有全国也不没有那是呢我们录制过哎刚才呢동번이 있어야 된다지 매백해서 말이지. 나랑서 로로 나오는 시직이 주요 말이지. 나랑서 로로 거리시는 것도서는 된징원의 예버지 나용이 요래. 취미이식 남도가 조단에 샤티기 요래. 어디 봐 재주잖아. 어디네 나 관점 회시식이 시야 다라지. 나님이 좀 나와도 주요 말이지. 다 네가 안 줘되기 요래. 다 들려야 에네 나란즈르 컨디션는 것도가 람나 에네 간다 최대한테 탄년 주세 전시 원의 예버지를 넣어 나용이야래 어디디 나와도 에네 셴이 에네 취미이식 남도도 개용을 봐 어디에 인도산에 취미이식 남도기 에네 차당으로 끼기 인도산에 다 취미이식 남도 맞이해야 돼 간다 최남 전형원의 예바 나와도 담버 짐베 덴지 내 되게 안 되시 집에 농사야 다들이 자상 되는 인도 다 간다 오면 따와 리베 때는 보니 다 나와도 주의미 잡아서 인도 아니 지 남든지 리고서야로 남게 리고서야로 직투제 리고서야로 되는 뭔가도 시인도 전에 그 전형원에 아니 예버지 나한테버디 나와다도 좀 해봐 타셔버시기 로로 내야도 와 에네 안데디 우문주가 나리야 가지랑 생이 땡주나 텔레그룹 오부지그시 동니 오부지그 주주나 대지심이 디싱어이면 건신 오부들아 남자나 뒤니 당신 뭘 수르도 내님이 디신직된이 타녀잖아 나버리 재미샤스 다 직den기 다 타녀 상당년을 스펜 너나 상제의 심진사로 주주 삼으로 마다 마셰베 셰발이야 낭니 타녀도 작외거는 여보마도 던지는 여보 제여 말이스 어디도 송이 못도가 자상가 던지인데 다 처진의 유진기 외세 디기식시 다 처진의 에네 유 던진원의 변낭대학이 다디 나와도 좀 매도我的人性主动语言为谁真正那个呢可他们可多了语言个为谁的无数有的反正都的广州的蛮多的广州嘛个啥对地区为你们多娘的拿了落差的送应多啊可他们个了送小的콜로 타면 도도 광제도 야 콜로 발백걸로 송셰베 최 탐시 명점 다좀 써야지 롤레도 마숑아 롤 무슈르 저라 아니야 천이 숨그 남샤 쳇네 아니 가자디 군다 뭐니 군다랑 생이 뭐 주고 상왕 용주랑 생이 주고 선 송샤디东西向往这让个生他从事移动下运的被的损害去日本来他的这日本来我他的这个这个约的这个上路考运的我的当的汽车团的主这样的车子但这个他呢搞修的样的看到从事讲解的那我到的因为要的钱呢到底要嘛这些呢 콜로 파르디 심삼베 따와디 콜로 타메 안다 가사디 너도 공제 때문에 날 때도 숨고도가 쟤네 사던 게 어디 시야지 된다들이 다 간다 디니자로게 유전에서 시대에 그게 뭐에 내주디 단어 봐야지 아니 콜로 파르베 유유에서 시대에 그 리베람네 그게 단어 봐야지 너도가 저상가 뭐에 내주디 다 시고요 내가 지금 최신의 캐버 지금 잠만 정해를 해야지 시정을 최신고 직생 걸어 봐. 봐. 사든지 인도 안다 낭배 신분당로네 아니 넘버 또버서도 건지죠래. 아니 시바 차라 건지죠래. 어다이네 더 내가 이제 공연 시바 전에 이제 일루 아니 일루를 차라 먹고 여도 저도 신의 직다 임지 당시 송유구도가 사든지 인도 가다 시코가로 거야 돼 머리가 방 자유고요래 양대 도야 돼 아니 머리 방배 가서 머리부에 녀부이시 줄을 제네 아니 저왕원도 해야지 또 숨도가 사든지 인도 시바코라 시부 개시부 서도가 사든지 인도 내가 콘다 탐지기 시청에게 시바서야 돼 건지죠래 뒤자주셔야 돼 개시부 서요래 저사가 낭배신구 나로네 아니 다 가다 치숙 그게 자주셔야 요래 그 뒤처럼을 주고 그렇게는 즉 자주셔야 요래 이제 조조디 sem컴르버디 조chen 소용구도 와 그래서 인도 다 저렇게 해서 말한 저 하다 천일군님도 계시시뒤 친구를 뭔가르버디 천일군수 자주시라 전에 야 다주셔야 요래 내수 야 다주셔야 요래 다 sem컴르버고라 안다 노조네 천지 영어를 천지 나로로 sem컴르 그거 어디 안다 시라가 잘 마무리 세상 가서 그냥 내가 다고 거라 말한지 일루다 공에 에는 넘버시와 일루 넘버시와 주부 이기 남시스야 내가 전적이 어디에 거시 채도금도가 그래서 다 드리게서 레베 천리고 레베 내수 14지기다 제셔로 당에 되지 다 sem게 남도 잠면저 옆에 거도로 레베 소소소 칠레면 잡지 용대하지 시기도가 그래서 인도산에 나 가다 sem컴르버디 드리게서 제 가서 만담을 찾으셔 다디 지자하게 아니 너르고 시행 나로라 아니 처음에 왔다 닝지사디 시행인데 간다 sem컴도 좋아요래 아니 로페지 니동 권에 아니 야나라 아니 신내다 항도사데 심지식의 신내 아니 유럽의 제베 잡아치하게 있네 소소도 시럽게 라보로 통화사 디즈제디 야가로 해줄로 니동 권에 유여되시르샤 제상가 다 sem컴르버디 먼저 안데 시고하시다 드리케스 뒤줄러 아니 응강검을 야 다시 요래데 만당의 차디 sem컴르버 만당하지 다디 출루께서 말이 시행 두시체니 these are not necessarily considered something religious thing but these are academic subjects simply our knowledge increase 사실은 인도 그다다 벌고 안다 천일군님도리야 아주 깨지체니 지금 sem컴을 배고로 고두치야 지금 몽고 아주 제대로 요래 다디 편도도가 어디 천일군 나네 sem컴을 배고라 다 자가가 리숑 엔디나제는 남배 리숑 나로네 지금 sem컴을 배고로 수부지저라 믹스에 통하지 제용구도
So I'll very briefly summarize. So the point Holiness was making is that if you look at the resources that we find in Buddhism, the primary emphasis is really placed on understanding the nature of reality, as was mentioned before. And one of the key points that emerges is that a fundamental source of our problem, from which all the afflictions arise, is really ignorance about the nature of reality. And one of the aim is to find a way to bring an end to that entire mechanism that give rise to these afflictions rooted in ignorance. And one approach seems to be, as we mentioned before, in naturally, there are progressive levels of consciousness, and the subtlest one arising naturally at the point of death. So one technique that we see in Buddhism is an approach which culminates in the advanced Vajrayana text, particularly the highest yoga tantra, but the indications of this is already in the third turning teachings, where there is an emphasis on understanding what could be referred to as the subjective clear light, where the understanding is that there is progressive levels of subtlety in consciousness, and as you reach further and further subtle, then you are moving further and further away from the influences of conceptualization and all the other grosser levels of activity. So in tantric, Vajrayana approach seems to be really trying to use techniques. Some of these may be pranayama, wind-based yogic practices, which are aimed at progressively bringing our own states of consciousness to progressively deeper, subtler states, which are further and further freer from these influences of the afflictions. That's one way of ultimately moving towards this pure luminosity. The other approach, and that needs to be combined, is what we find in the teachings of the second turning of the wheel, the perfection of wisdom teachings, and which are really articulated and explained, elaborated in Nagarjuna's writing and Aryadeva and their writings. And there, the point being made is that underlying all of our perception of reality is this fundamental grasping at some kind of enduring intrinsic reality, and which then serves as the basis for creating this whole edifice of our naive perception of reality, which then give rise to our emotional relation to the world and all of this. So the aim here is to really get our understanding of the actual reality itself right. And again, through a process of deconstruction, layers after layer, working at our various levels of grasping and deconstructing them through pointing out how actually the way the world seems to us is not the way actually the world exists. And one point, for example, Aryadeva makes is that the way in which the ignorance, grasping at intrinsic objective existence, is so pervasive, it's like just as the body faculty pervades all of our other senses, in the same manner, this ignorance pervades, this reifying ignorance pervades all of our perceptions of reality. And therefore, the only way in which we can undo this is to gain insight into the emptiness of which is the ultimate reality, and therefore understand world purely in terms of dependent origination. And so Aryadeva says, therefore, those who are serious about this should really strive to always engage in the discourse on dependent origination. So the point here is that whether it is increasingly refining our understanding of actual objective world by way of the emptiness teaching, or progressively lessening our dependence on the coarser levels of mind and getting to this subtler level, both of these are premised upon understanding the nature of reality. And in this way, and here we can, one point that emerges is that whether we are talking about liberation, nirvana, or samsara, unenlightenment or ignorance, in the end is a function of our mind, function of our either ignorance or elimination of ignorance. So therefore, in Indian traditions in general, and particularly in Buddhist tradition, there's so much emphasis placed on understanding the nature of mind, because even whether we are talking about wisdom or ignorance, we are talking about consciousness. And so getting understanding of consciousness becomes really crucial. And that has nothing to do with religion. It's really understanding reality. It can be treated as an academic subject. Therefore, of course, Buddhist tradition, classical Buddhist traditions take great interest in understanding the physical world, there are various theories and ideas about the physical world. But when it comes to the understanding the material world, contemporary science is very advanced. There's very rich, detailed understanding and account of the nature of the physical world. But where there are big gaps in the contemporary science is really in the area of mind science. And this is one area where Indian tradition in general, and particularly Buddhism, has a lot to offer. Not only is there huge discussions and understanding of the theory of mind and consciousness and so on, but also there are techniques and methods that are developed, for example, like how to develop a focused mind with single-pointedness, and how to develop our critical faculty so that we will be able to examine the nature of reality in a very probing manner. So these are broadly referred to as the two types of practices. One is the resting, shamatha type practice. The other one is analytic, discursive, vipassana practice. So that's one of the reasons why we have had so many dialogues with scientists, and scientists who are particularly working in the mind science domain find dialoguing with Buddhist scholars and Buddhist thought very enriching and beneficial. And for example, like neuroscience, as they begin to dig deeper into the brain and its correlates with consciousness, they are beginning to even talk about brain correlates of even conceptual thought processes, thoughts and ideas and so on. But the one basic fact is, even with that sophisticated, explanation, the underlying concept seems to be still quite impoverished. For example, there is no categorical distinction between sensory modalities versus the mental, what in the Indian tradition we would call manas or yigisheva. That distinction between wangshe, sensory modality versus mental modality doesn't seem to be even there. So here in Buddhist Indian tradition and Buddhist sources, we find all of these differentiations in a very detailed way: sensory versus concept, thought, and mental versus sensory, and subtle levels of consciousness, coarser levels of consciousness. So therefore, there is a huge resource when it comes to the mind science, where scientists can really benefit, and Buddhist dialogue with Buddhism can contribute to that body of knowledge.
Now, till I think later part of 20th century, 20th century, you see people, I think, never pay attention about mind. So when we say mind, just a brain. Now, as a result of investigation, people who already sort of die, their heart beating stop, then blood circulation to brain stop. Then, generally speaking, he dead, but body still remain fresh. 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, like that. So, through scientific sort of the, because of the, so no explanation. Then another thing, young children, some very clearly mentioned about their past life, very clearly. I also met some young sort of child, some Indian also, not Buddhist. I met 2 Indian small girl, very, very clearly memory, remember about their past life, their home, their parents, their sort of relatives, like that. So now, gradually, you see, scientists who simply, you see, believe brain, now they begin to investigate. There is something which affects on our brain. So what's that? Now we say chit, or mind. So now, gradually now, among some scientists, now begin to think or investigate about what the factor which affect our brain. And also, you see, children who remember about past life very convincingly, right? So brain completely new. Their past body's brain is dead, gone. Then what's the sort of, what thing brings memory about past life? So these sort of factor, we have to find answer according pure scientist. So now, later part of 20th century, you see some scientists now really showing interest about mind. When we say mind, the different level, as I already mentioned. So now, you see some material in Buddhist literature. So therefore, Buddhist literature, we can divide three: science, philosophy, and religion. Since a few years, I request to compile about science, mainly science of mind. Then philosophy. So now, I was told some Chinese universities professors, you see, after seeing this book, they a little bit sort of surprised. Tibetan Buddhist tradition is something scientific religion. It is true. It is true. More subtle level, I think science at the Buddhist sort of concept, I think mutual learning, very useful, very helpful. So I myself consider half Buddhist monk, half scientist. Like that. So now in 300 volumes, we can make three parts. I think I already mentioned. One, science, mainly mind, and then particles, and then wave, these things, some information from Buddhist text. Then philosophy, now quantum physics, quite similar, the Nagarjuna's sort of view, like that. So these are academic subject, not religious, not necessarily religious thing. So we can divide science, philosophy, and religion. Religion for Buddhist practitioner, but two other academic subjects. So I thought useful to combine like that. So now.
Thank you. Yes, Your Holiness. Sorry, Your Holiness.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Holiness.
Now some questions.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, sorry, Your Holiness. Thank you so much. That was so amazing. I feel like you answered nearly all my questions in one go. And Your Holiness, it seems like these books can be considered a record of the Nalanda master's reasonings, their analysis, and that you're hopeful that it helps the dialogue with scientists, and that might benefit the world. I was wondering, Your Holiness, do you see these books benefiting the world in other avenues other than through a dialogue with scientists?
편도 이걸 배세.
나 생리버상 이들에 나와서
I think I usually mentioning hygiene of physical and hygiene of emotion. Now, we need hygiene of physical already we have. Now, hygiene of emotion not yet. So now today's world, the over 7 billion human beings, everyone want happy life and healthy physical. But since I think out of ignorance, how to keep peace of mind, then is a certain mental level, some anger, fear, these things should happen. Then the physical hygiene also now has the effect. So now time come, we should pay. We should have knowledge how to keep physical health. That's hygiene of physical. Meantime, we can see many people physically very healthy, but mentally too much worry, too much fear. So they also need hygiene of emotion. These are not religious thing, simply knowledge. So now modern scientists, I think firstly scientists should pay some attention how to bring peace of mind. Not talking next life, not talking Buddhahood or God's place, simply how to be more day by day peaceful mind, particularly when we come across some problem. In spite of that problem, we can, if we have certain technique, we can keep peace of mind. You know, one sort of was the Shantadeva's book. You see, he mentioned, best teacher is our enemy. From enemy, you can learn many things. So enemy is best teacher, so we should feel grateful. So then I think the essence is real troublemaker is self-centered feeling and things externally used to come. So to these also the problem, the understanding things like enemy, friend is actually firstly our mental creation. So in mental level, equality. And as I mentioned earlier, all troublemaker is best teacher. Thinking this line, you see, you get much peaceful also the mind. Then that's quite unique Buddhist sort of philosophy. Nothing exists as appears. These are very useful to keep our mind, peaceful mind. When anger comes, we have some also the method to reduce that. And too much attachment come, we have method to reduce that. So through that way, peaceful mind, equality, like that.
Wow.
So I am trying, not propagating Buddhism. Simply, you see, you can pick up certain way of thinking as an academic subject, like that. Okay, now next.
Thank you, Your Holiness. I think that was very illuminating, and everyone would love some of that peace of mind. So, Your Holiness, I think now I wanted to ask Dechen, who was Dechen Richard, who was the translator of the volume, to share a bit of her experience translating the volume with you. So, Dechen, Dr. Richard.
Hello.
I've unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, firstly, Your Holiness, I would like to thank you so much. I'm deeply honored and most grateful for the opportunity to serve you in this capacity as a translator and to make my humble contribution towards fulfilling your inconceivable wishes. Thank you so much. Okay. As for something interesting, where do I begin? So, translating is often a solitary activity. In this case, I have been fortunate to work with the four Geshe editors in Dharamsala and with John Dunne in Madison, as well as discussing with Ian Coghlan and with Jinpa at the end, towards the end of the project. So these collaborations have been among the highlights of my experience. So I think to build Dharma friendships, good friendships, where there is mutual respect and mutual appreciation and mutual trust is like tremendously important. It's a fundamental thing. So that's the foundation of my experience in this case. Now, next point, this text contains a wide range of highly technical material. So translating it in a way that makes it accessible to a modern audience has been a challenge. And that is going to continue. This work of building bridges between the authentic traditional texts, the ideas contained there, and some of the very advanced ideas in the Western disciplines, science, philosophy, and so on. This is going to take a long time. It's going to be a gradual process. There's going to be people writing essays, papers, maybe some collaborations with making books. So I think this particular project, your wonderful project, is a fantastic foundation. This is really reliable. It gives reliable foundation from which we can build bridges. And I think the bridge building will be very interesting indeed. So I would hope to, contribute towards that. If I live long enough, if I keep in good health, I would love to be one of the many people who can contribute towards that. So there's also, in working on this project, it's introduced me further to the wonderful classical Indian Buddhist literature. I already had studied, of course, with some great masters, including yourself, Your Holiness. But to work on translating these texts, one has to delve deeply into the material, and you get a wide range of familiarity there.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the wonderful Buddhist scriptures, some of which I'm familiar with from a long time, some of which were quite new to me. So, it's a nice, it enriches my understanding. It's a long process, of course. There's a long way to go, but I really am grateful for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dechen.
That's about it, really. That's, yeah.
Thank you, Dechen. Your Holiness, before we conclude with your closing remarks, I'd like to invite Thupten Jinpa, a longtime principal translator for His Holiness, the series editor, and an integral part of this project as a whole, to share some of his reflections on the importance of the series. Thupten Jinpa.
Okay.
Thank you. Your Holiness, colleagues and friends, I'm deeply honored to be a part of today's book launch of the second volume of Science and Philosophy in the Indian Buddhist Classics. I had the privilege to be present when the first volume was launched in Bodh Gaya, India in 2018. To date, this first volume is being translated into some 13 languages, and many of the translators are actually present joining in this Zoom. One thing I would like to underscore is the highly ambitious nature of the series, of which today's volume is the second. What His Holiness has conceived and created in the form of this series is truly revolutionary in the history of Buddhist thought of more than 2,500 years. For the first time, readers have the opportunity to engage deeply with the science and philosophy from the classical Buddhist sources in a format that is carefully curated for the contemporary reader. These volumes contain lengthy citations from original texts, many of which have never been translated into any European language, making the series a landmark publication. Key motivation on the part of His Holiness creating this special series has been to offer as gifts to the larger world the insights, knowledge, and wisdom of India's great Nalanda masters like Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, Asanga Vasubandhu, Dignaga, Dharmakirti, whom we Tibetans refer to as the six ornaments of the world, Gentuk, Zamlingzebe Gentuk, as well as Shantideva, Shantarakshita, and so forth. We Tibetans take great pride in having been historically the custodian of this Nalanda heritage. This particular second volume is on the science of mind from the Buddhist sources. The volume draws on four main categories of Buddhist literature. One is Abhidharma, roughly psychology and phenomenology, which presents perhaps the world's first systematic attempt to develop what could be called the map of mind. Abhidharma offers the analysis of the structure of our mental life with careful differentiations of the various facets of our experience in terms of what are called mental factors, Cetashika or Simjung in Tibetan. The second source the volume draws on is the Buddhist epistemological writings, especially of Dignaga, Dharmakirti, Dharmottara, and Shantarakshita, known as Pramana epistemology, which His Holiness referred to. Pramana epistemology offers analysis of the nature of consciousness, mind's relationship with reality, and the various modalities of cognition, especially perception and thought. The third source includes Vajrayana text, particularly belonging to the highest yoga class, which His Holiness already referred to, which presents a unique view of consciousness where in the final analysis, mind and body are understood to be two inseparable facets, energy and awareness, lungsem, of a non-dual single reality. Finally, it draws on the Yogacara sources, which present what I might call mind-based technology or meditation techniques to train and transform our mind. As John Dunne already noted in his remarks, this volume will be of special importance to contemporary researchers in the fields of neuroscience, psychology, clinical science, and philosophy of mind. As the editor of the series, I would like to thank Dr. Dechen Roshat and Professor John Dunne for their masterful translation of this second volume, and John for his excellent essays introducing each of the main sections of the book. I thank Wisdom Publication, its publisher Daniel Aitken, and senior editor David Kittlestrom and his colleague Mary Petrusevich for their dedication to producing such a wonderful, beautiful volume. And of course, I would like to thank the four monastic scholars, Geshe Changjub Sangye, who is today the abbot of Gandanishadze College, my own alma mater, Geshe Ngawa Sangye of Drepung Loseling College, Geshe Chilsat Drungje Rinpoche of Gandan Changze College, and Geshe Lobsang Kunjo of Drepung Gomang College, who worked for many years preparing the Tibetan original of the series. For me personally, it has been truly a profound honor to be able to play some role in making this important vision of His Holiness a reality. Your Holiness, in conclusion, I would like to inform you that the work on the remaining 2 volumes of the series is well underway, with Professor Donald Lopez translating volume 3 and Dr. Dechen Roshat working on the final 4th volume. Hopefully, these 2 volumes will be released within the next 2 years. And when this happens, the contemporary world will have a most remarkable resource on the insights and wisdom of the great Nalanda masters, just as you have envisioned. Your Holiness, I know as a monk, you do not like to think in terms of personal legacy, but there is no doubt in my mind, at least, that this series will remain one of your greatest gifts to humanity. Thank you.
Okay. Like you see about mind and certain sort of things, the ngombazu abhidhamma
kosha.
Abhidhamma kosha. At meantime, we have to keep the gender critics Tini Shesin Samun Jigrum Dini, Mongum Yili, Joey, Never Doyun Dini, Sanjashan, Shangi Tusu, Chimiju, Satina Lolia, Yin Yin the, Chojalam Buddha, what is it, Eddie, Gudwa, Di, any Zigo Maris. Sadi, Kada Dotava, Chongu Shisha, Chesangarazu, Di Luk Nishani, Gagara Kebe. Shungli Jungo Yina Yang, Yanko, Penna Rizu Lingsling Desat Zedi, Takanda Musum Nyung Yorba. So Desedi, Kazanga Zustigo Yamare. Ta, she Terikesa, Tang Nazujita, Kasure, Mashive, Chig, Shen Saba, Chig Rine Saba, Dindit Sulea, the Kashurisha. Chazanga de Juguranji. Para nelo de yao xiu re sha sa ede tongpani dawa ko le tagi mo khon shu ma be ho sha sa de zhe nga nin da shi de sang dang go re cha sa wa de yin de ya yan shi ja ge ke be sung ze de nga zo ke le kwa ke bu do ko kan da din yang zo sam le sha go shi sha.
So one point that is important is that since here in this volume we have brought so many classical Indian Buddhist texts together, one point to bear in mind is just because something emerges in the classical Buddhist text does not mean that we need to take them at their face value or even seriously. For example, like one of the key sources in this volume is Abhidhamma, and Abhidhamma Kosha being a prime example of that literature. But in Abhidhamma Kosha, there are also many things which we don't need to take seriously. For example, like the description of the cosmos, the Mount Meru-centered, cosmology and so on, which we know from now modern scientific understanding, they're actually quite contrary to the actual evidence of the senses. And furthermore, even in the Buddhist tradition, for example, Chandrakirti says in his Entering the Middle Way that he includes among the great masters of India, such as Dharmakirti, Vasubandhu and Dharmapala and so on, who he lists as those who have not finally penetrated the depth of understanding the nature of reality. In other words, these masters, despite being great thinkers, have still not arrived at the bottom of understanding the teaching on emptiness. So I think it is important to make a distinction that what kind of classical material we're using and in what context. And so this critical differentiation should be part of this. For example, I'm a great admirer of His Holiness. I'm talking about His Holiness. I'm a great admirer of Chandrakirti, and these days I've been reading every now and then Chandrakirti's own auto-commentary on Entering the Middle Way. And as I mentioned before, his exposition of Nagarjuna's teaching on emptiness is so thorough and so detailed and so groundbreaking. So I think that kind of differentiation, critical differentiation, needs to be a part of our engagement with the classical sources.
Oh yeah. Any
question?
Some questions. some questions?
Oh, yes. Some questions. Your Holiness, we were wondering, so you were talking about these books and there being like rational thinking, and they're like records of rational thinking. How does one use these books? How does one use these books to actually, become a better person? And how do they relate to secular ethics, for example?
가서
secular ethics
세kul에 들어 뒤쳐 과학의 생명.
말다 미규마 저 니리 미진나리아 탭도 주톤 랍자를 가르치게 돼.
And you see, not sort of emphasis about next life. right? 가기 생명 커도 그렇지 않아도. Okay.
So the point His Holiness is making is that the perspective presented here is actually universal and secular. For example, there is no discussion at all about next life or any of the very specifically Buddhist religious concepts.
So Your Holiness, we were hoping you could talk about, like close with talking about your vision for the book and series. What's your hopes for the whole series and what's your vision for the series?
가서
단데 디초디 디림바친 땡고로 리토르 겨우름 지야지 마음베 지 공차저보다 지 비유저 근데 간데시 레와저 나이 아니 들이나이 간데나스
I already mentioned you see the modern time you see in the field of material thing highly developed, but about mind, about emotion, there's not much sort of information, not much research work. And the reality, now today's world, a lot of problem, as I mentioned earlier, is our own creation. Meantime, nobody wants a problem, but many problems our own creation. So now we need method, you see, to keep our mind more peaceful. When we're facing some problem, how to keep our mind. So for that, it is very useful to know the whole system of our mind, our emotion. So that's my main, also the hope. According to my own experience, so like Shantadeva's book, and Nagarjuna, and the Kasa, Aryadeva, so on. You see, their book very helpful to keep my mind peace. See, my life, you see, whole my life, you see, through trouble, problem. But my mind, quite peaceful. So this sort of knowledge, extremely helpful to keep peace of mind. So many human brothers, sisters, you see, certainly can be very useful to know more material, more sort of ideology, or I don't know, how to keep our mind when we face some problem, how to tackle this. So that's my only hope. Okay.
Thank you, Your Holiness. Thank you, Your Holiness. It's been such an honor and privilege to share this time with you. I really, for Wisdom Publications, it's an amazing opportunity to serve His Holiness and to publish these books and work with such fine and distinguished professors and Thupten Jinpa. For us, it's an amazing amount of interdependence that comes together to produce these records of reasoning from the Nalanda tradition and make that offering to the rest of the world. And so, Your Holiness, it's such an honor to be with you, such an honor to do this work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Midwa.
That's all.
가, 나로. 투시, 미, 가다 미몽구지 깔래 gem니 엔다 자게나리 규리어 게이 몽구지나 규리어와 엔 장 사모로 미 깔래 gem니 가다 제시 샤요리 다 개체디 군루 개체물이 맞아 나버신 거는 쉐베이나 그러다 샴페인 군루 야오치 당에 디규 대비스제 무도 소투 선배서로 야 민도 소투 선배서디 야 아주 군루 차네 양코 랑기 겨워 주요리 간다 댐베 샴디 주요리 주보고 양 군루 차네 양코 따다버게 겨마잖아 야 뒤에 가서 경험을 들어다 간다디 지신나가 내봐던 로 지신 내주고 지시다는 내주는 로동에 싸워셔서 다 디상당고리 천디상마인베 처럼처럼 에다 지진 대화신이 되게 란든 될래쇼 말 되게 샌든 될래쇼 지진 대화신이 되게 샌든 될래쇼 지진 동해신이 되게 란든 될래쇼 다들 생겨도내다 양다 자오를 마셔도 선진이도 민주주 코와나야 대화면 대경의 근세의 전주섬이 따시는 되는 대화를 로하라 심시 수시 기루유사 어디 딩아서 상당거래 소수지 겨와 강주가 뒤디 배시하는 패버지하시 팬디용야 아니 당아서 패버지면이야 이제 랑진지로 또 쉐베이나 아주 패배 창동야 저르다 별 산재가 때문에 지 라마 이즘사르지다 지 아니 나르스도 부르스도 참으로시게 되지만 맨들지기 뭐나 전에기 지금 상관없이 꼴로베 뭐나 전에기다 가서 그래 로존 제가 좀더 마세베 곰냠린 제니 된지기 다 때바 시주 송지기 전에 롱도 때바 진주 배송 아주 별 미리기 노동자들도 제요리 kenji shiwozi ngazo ya nalende chugi ziru nambe jela ngazo huda bada chene zo 참아지고 슝도 우메 슝도 주체티 장니 어다 지 간다 지 건조된 유스를 전에 지 최로야 소지 뭐임바 로선시아 예드버지 다 도사되어래 에는 내는 주 다바디스되기 당아서 남버서 들으면 니슈베 남버 쳐거다스 당하면 알아줬다 지 가서 그래 초거를 때 애니들레이션 때려 뭐임바 다 간다지 천리부 투니 지금 아주 저세게 무슨 자야여다 봐 지금 간다 섬거를 고 소울 기베 뜻을 저리 샤여다 지기 어다 들으시 저거래 다 그래 들으시
뜻이 교사가나
들으시 양 제마 제용 들으시 야 들으시
Thank you, Your Holiness.
어르신들, 니 뒤에 디바지 란체 콘수 빠르지 디지 세르시.
Mhm.